Power up initiated. All systems
some bad
nominal.
guys, sir.
Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video, and for today's Windows sequel to a DOS game, we're taking a look at EarthSiege 2. Now, this video isn't going to be nearly as long as the last one, as there's actually very little to say about this game, which I haven't already talked about in my original coverage of the first EarthSiege game, because, well, this game's virtually identical in terms of raw gameplay, but there's been considerable enhancements to make the experience less cumbersome and more interesting. Now, EarthSiege 2, just like the original EarthSiege, was created by Dynamics and published through Sierra Online, originally coming out in 1996, though there's also a dual case only release from 1997, and that's the one I have. Amazingly, despite primarily being developed for Windows 95 using early versions of DirectX, it also runs in Windows 3.1 without DirectX, although I've never actually tried doing so. The whole reason why DirectX came to exist was to give programmers direct hardware access to things like the video card and I/O devices. That's something which wasn't really possible to do in the very early days of Windows 95. The story of EarthSiege 2 follows directly after the events of the first game, in that the Cybrid forces, originally created to fight humanity's wars but now operating of their own volition, are taking steps to launch one final all-out strike against Earth. The only way to prevent this catastrophe is to take out the primary AI controlling the entire Cybrid army, known as Prometheus, the core of which is located in a facility on the dark side of the moon. You're assigned to 3 different sectors over the course of the game before launching to the moon to take on the primary Cybrid forces. And between missions, you need to allocate salvage, perform repairs, and customize your hercs with various weapons and equipment. One thing that's neat is that new equipment becomes available more frequently in this game than in the original, plus you start with access to a lot of things which either didn't exist in the original game or required the expansion, such as the Apocalypse herc. I will admit though, many of the new weapons are just slightly more powerful versions of pre-existing weapons, including shorter range, though they also added in an extraordinarily powerful plasma cannon, and a number of non-weapon equipment which can enhance your herc in various ways, such as by making it difficult for missiles to track it, or by enhancing your shielding. Now, something I should point out, the performance you're seeing here isn't spectacular, and I'm not quite sure why it's so slow. As you might expect, I'm running this through DXWin on my modern Windows 10 rig, and 99% of the time the game runs smooth as silk. It's only when no major updates to the graphics are occurring that the speed of the game suddenly dies, and I imagine it's an idling thing. Normally this pre-mission stuff works flawlessly on period-correct machines. The actual gameplay has gotten a huge facelift too. The graphics now all run at 640 by 480 instead of 320 by 200, and everything looks just that much sharper and cleaner. A low-resolution mode does still exist, but when this game came out, you'd have to be running a really old system to not be able to handle the higher-res graphics. The music is also fully digitized now instead of being part digital and part synth, and even though the tracks are fairly generic, they all fit the game really well and have a sort of sense of epicness to them. One feature missing which I actually enjoyed from the previous game though is the ability to set weapon energy limits. In the original game, you could turn down how much power your high-powered weapons could charge up to, thus limiting how long an electron flux blast would last for, or limiting how much power would be charged into the particle beam shots. You don't get a choice in this anymore, which does kind of limit your builds a little. It's not really that huge an issue. A welcome addition is much stronger joystick support, although you have to actually be in a mission and access the mission menu with the F12 key to get access to the joystick customization screen. Now, just like Descent 3, this game plays amazing with full rudder and throttle controls, and you can set them up to a fairly decent degree. although the game tops out at the first 8 buttons for joystick access, even though DirectX originally supported up to 32 buttons per joystick. This means to use more than 8 buttons, you'll need to use a third-party program like Joy2Key, and you'll also likely need to run it with administrator access, otherwise the inputs may not be detected properly. There's also a new flying craft you get access to called the Razor. This thing... okay, let's put it this way. It was a neat idea, and they made it possible to arm this thing to the teeth. But it's very wacky to fly and very imprecise. It moves so fast, you have so little real control over it, that most of the time, attacking with it just doesn't feel satisfying. Not to mention the weapons in this game have such short range that by the time you're in range to attack, you already have to start pulling away so you don't slam into your target. Also, keep in mind that the Razor has its own set of controls to configure, so you technically have to set up your controls twice when playing through this game. Once for your Hercs, and again for the Razor. Interestingly enough, despite the overhaul of the graphics and audio, the underlying game engine is virtually identical to the first game. And even the floating point rounding bug, which causes your shield allocation to be off by 1 unit, is still present, as is the bug where friendlies firing at will can end up trying to destroy air skimmers without following you to your waypoints. But there are a couple quality of life improvements at least. You can now tell friendly units to fire at will before enemies have even begun to appear. Though as stated, if you want them to form up on you and ignore the air skimmers, you're still going to want to tell them to hold their fire instead. You're also allowed to quit successful missions now the instant the area is secured and no more enemies are around. Plus, air skimmers will stop spawning when missions are complete, so that you can actually properly secure an area in the first place. The gameplay is otherwise the exact same as the original EarthSiege. It's just done way better. The balancing is better, the access to good equipment is better, the AI for your own squad mates is better. Like, this is how a proper sequel to a game should feel. Like the same game, but better. So, now let's talk about how to obtain this game and how to get it working on a modern system. But firstly, the game is cheap as free now. A couple years back, a company known as Hi-Rez Studios, who are the current holder of the Metaltech license, and thus everything related to EarthSiege and StarSiege, decided to release all of the legacy games in the series as freeware. You can download any of them, with the exception of Battledrome for whatever reason, from the Tribes Universe website at www.tribesuniverse.com. Or, if you want a physical copy, they're very common and very reasonably priced. The jewel case release can go for as little as a couple bucks used, closer to $15 still sealed, and the original boxed copy ranges between $20 and $40 depending on condition. However, getting the game working on a modern system is a little tricky. Not as hard as Descent 3, but it has its own quirks. Firstly, if you run this game on an old Windows 95 or 98 system, you will have 0 issues. This game runs rock solid, and I don't think I've ever had it crash on me, not even after I got it working right here on Windows 10. But to run it on modern Windows, you're absolutely going to need DxWind. The installer for this game should work without any major issues, though it may run into the same issue the Descent 3 installer does, where it may just pause for several minutes after you start it up before it actually does anything. Once installed, run DxWind and perform the following configuration steps. Step 1. Create a new entry in DxWind for EarthSiege 2 and modify its properties. Step 2. Set the folder to where you installed the game, set the launch path to es.exe, and set the standard executable path to vshell.exe. Step 3. Not only are you going to want to run the game in a window to avoid screwing up your desktop from resolution changes, you absolutely need to turn off the DxWind startup banner, as this feature can completely glitch out the game at random, since it's actually going to be switching between executables frequently. Step 4. Set your initial window size to something decent at a 4:3 standard aspect ratio. 1280 by 960 is exactly double the game's native 640 by 480 resolution, and works great if you have a 1080p monitor. Step 5. In the Video tab, set the window size and position to locked size, and set the screen resolution as both an initial and maximum of the resolution you set in the previous step. Step 6. Set the virtual color setting to 8 bits per pixel. This is to prevent the game from getting mad at you for not running it in 256 colors. Step 7. In the DirectX tab, if you're playing in a window which is an exact multiple of 640 by 480, such as 1280 by 960, set filtering to D-Draw Default. This should result in super crisp pixels as opposed to blurry pixels. Step 8. In the second DirectX tab, force VSync on. This is to prevent certain minor aspects of the game from running way too fast, and since there's no hardware acceleration, the vertical sync should not introduce any input lag whatsoever, since there's not going to be any pre-rendered frames. Step 9. Double check that correct mouse position is checked in the input tab. Since we're going to be fooling the game into thinking it's running full screen despite running it in a window, this is absolutely necessary. However, you will notice that if the game thinks it's running in a window, unchecking this will be necessary instead, but you don't want to do that. Step 10. Go back to your DXWin program list and duplicate your EarthSiege 2 entry. Rename the new entry to differentiate it as the actual simulation aspect of the game, since it uses a separate executable. Step 11. Modify your newly duplicated entry and remove the launch path entirely while changing the primary executable path to point to dbsim.exe. And step 12. The first time you run the game, it's likely going to be running in windowed mode and your mouse cursor is likely not going to work properly. Just hit Alt-Enter once you get to the main menu. This will flip the game from windowed to full screen. However, because of the steps we took in DXWin, it will actually trick the game into running in full screen mode in a window of the size that you designated. From this point forward, the mouse cursor should work fine and you're ready to play the game. Yeah, it's a solid number of steps and it's easy to get confused as to whether the mouse is working or busted, since one of the settings literally makes or breaks it depending on if the game thinks it's running windowed or full screen, but once you've got it working, it's going to run solidly. The only thing to consider if you want to record footage of the game is that because it's using multiple executables, you'll probably just want to capture the appropriate desktop rectangle instead, as trying to capture the application window directly may cause issues with your capture software. And that's it. Overall, EarthSiege 2 is just a better game than the original EarthSiege, period. If you've never played either EarthSiege games before, this is likely the one you'll want to start with. It's easier to get a handle on, and even though it's tricky to initially set up on a modern system, once you've got it running, you're golden. Again though, if you plan to use a joystick with more than 8 buttons, remember to run your key mapping software with administrator privileges, otherwise the key mappings won't be detected properly by the game. Anywho, that's all for this filler video. Next one's going to be coming out on Saturday, December 9th. And as for what Windows sequel to a DOS game I'll be covering, well, consider this. So far, we've taken a look at a couple games which are faithful reimaginings of their original counterparts. The next game we're looking at is pretty much a sequel in name only, and has barely anything to do with the DOS title it was based off of. As before, there's a few games this could be, so be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned to see just how badly they butchered what could have been an awesome game. At least had they done it the way they were originally intending.
Mission successful.
Thanks for watching everyone, and special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.